All right, welcome everyone to Nutrition and Lifestyle Strategies for Transplant Patients. I'm going to hand the mic over to our panelists today.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah. I'm one of the transplant dietitians here. Today, we're going to be presenting a nutrition and lifestyle for transplant patients talk. A little bit about this presentation. We're going to be going over some topics that you may have heard about before, but we feel that's pretty important to talk about, especially heading into the summer months. Got some nice summer topics to go over, as well as some other transplant related information.
And the content today has been developed for individuals, their families, as well as providers spanning all types of solid organ transplant. So participants today may have already received a transplant or maybe on the waiting list for a transplant. So the content today is meant to serve as general advice and not to replace any previous information or recommendations that you've received from your other healthcare providers.
Yeah, so a little bit about us. My name, again, is Hannah. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Vermont, studying nutrition, food science, and dietetics. I completed my dietetic internship at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Throughout my career, I have had experience in inpatient clinical work, rehab, long-term care, as well as dialysis before coming to transplant. And something I love most about being a dietitian is that I really get to know my patients and being able to figure out the best ways to help them reach their nutrition goals. It is a very rewarding career.
Welcome everyone. My name is Paul. My background is in culinary arts and food science. I went to Johnson & Wales University for my undergrad, and I combined my master's degree and my supervised practice to become a dietitian through Framingham State. And my experience includes acute care, general medical, surgical, as well as surgical ICU coverage, and of course, transplant. What I love most about being a dietitian is that dietitians speak the language of food. We can translate medical recommendations into food and vice versa. And I enjoy how food has the power to bring us all together.
Great.
So topics we'll be discussing today include food safety, the importance of hydration, physical activity. We have the privilege of having Michelle Monahan here with us today, who will be discussing the Frontier Clinic. And we'll also be discussing some transplant-friendly summer recipe ideas before wrapping up and transitioning into our question and answer section.
Great. So kicking it off, our first topic will be a little bit about food safety. Food safety, it involves the cleaning, cooking, and chilling or storing of foods properly, as well as separating our raw foods and raw meats, especially from our foods that we're not going to be cooking, to keep them safe from foodborne illnesses or what we generally know as food poisoning. Why is food safety really important for our transplant patients? Eventually, hopefully that everyone is able to receive an organ transplant. To be able to protect that organ, we put our patients on immunosuppressive medications. These medications just keep that organ nice and safe within the body, but it does that by suppressing the immune system. This makes us more susceptible to foodborne illnesses. And we're less able to fight off these illnesses being on these medications. So it can lead to prolonged hospitalizations or other complications involving the transplanted organ. Some ways that we can really protect ourselves from these foodborne illnesses is by making sure we cook foods to the proper temperatures, especially getting that internal temperature to the recommended temperature, usually in Fahrenheit. We can use a food thermometer to determine this. Avoiding raw meats and raw fish, certain shellfish, sprouts, and unpasteurized dairy considered more high-risk foods for foodborne illness. washing fruits and vegetables well before eating them, because anything on the surface can get into the food when we cut into it. Washing your hands before you prepare food, usually for about 20 seconds, gets all that stuff that could transition from your hands onto the food off. And then usually we recommend against, buffets and self-service areas, just because we don't really know who's been touching the food. There's also risk that someone might have coughed in the food, and just higher risk for contamination. It's important that we check expiration dates and the quality of food before we consume it, making sure we're not eating anything that looks off or smells off. And when in doubt, throw it out. We just want to be extra cautious, especially when our immune system is suppressed. This is just an example of some of the recommended internal cooking temperatures. Usually the more foods that are mixed, such as in our leftovers or casseroles, or when we grind up meat, such as in ground meats, the temperature we need to cook it to is higher, because we want to kill off anything that's in the center of those foods. Generally, our higher risk meats are cooked to higher temperatures. And then, for eggs, we usually recommend anything above, over medium. We want that yolk to be a little bit cooked, as well as the yolk to be fully cooked through. It's just higher risk the more raw that we leave our meats. Some other ways we can protect the food that we eat is by controlling the temperature that that food is at. These bacteria and, viral stuff that can be in the food like certain temperatures for optimal growth. So, we want to keep our cold foods cold, hot foods hot, to prevent that bacterial growth. It's important to use insulated containers or coolers with ice packs when transporting food, especially in hot weather, so that we can keep that food at the proper temperature for as long as we can. We want to avoid consuming foods that have been left out at room temperature or in the heat for over an hour, as opposed to higher risk of bacterial and viral growth. And then especially at cookouts and picnics, we really want to make sure that we're not going for food after a long period of time is sitting out in the sun. We want to refrigerate those leftovers or perishable foods within, 2 hours. If you come home from the grocery store, make sure you put things right in the fridge, especially the higher the temperature outside. We want to refrigerate that food faster. And then usually when we're shopping, it's best to, shop those perishable items first, or those refrigerated items, so that they're not warming up as we're traveling around the rest of the grocery store. And then some other tips that we can use to protect our food is in the cooking and handling of our foods. So, when we're cooking raw meats along with some other foods that are not going to be heated up or cooked, we really want to use separate utensils and separate surfaces, and to prevent cross-contamination. We don't want to put anything like marinades from raw meats onto ready-to-eat foods that are not going to be heated, as you won't kill off anything that might have transitioned from that meat. In the fridge, we want to stack our meats under our perishable food so that nothing's dripping down. In your shopping cart, you can also wrap things in plastic bags so that we can prevent any drippage from getting onto foods that won't be cooked. It is also important to heat our leftovers till they're steaming or 165 degrees if you use a food thermometer, just for optimal safety, to make sure we're killing off anything that could have been contaminating the food while sitting in the fridge. And just to wrap that up, we don't want you to think anything's always out to get you. It's just about taking extra precaution to keep you safe, especially if your immune system is suppressed.
Next, we'll be discussing the importance of staying well hydrated after or in the warmer months. So with end-stage organ failure, especially with heart, liver, and kidney, it's very common to hold on to extra fluid. Your providers may recommend a specific volume of fluids to keep within over the course of the day. And this is very common pre-transplant, more so after transplant. It's important to stay well hydrated as long as you're not on a fluid restriction. What can make us dehydrated would be physical activity. We'd be losing fluids through sweat. Also through respiration or breathing, we can lose some fluid. in warmer weather, again, from sweat and other losses. Intuitively, not drinking enough fluids can increase our risk of becoming dehydrated, and then losses through diarrhea and vomiting can also increase our risk of dehydration. On the other end, symptoms of fluid overload or holding on to too much fluid would be increased blood pressure. You may notice swelling in certain parts of your body, such as legs, ankles, and feet. This is called edema. Depending on where that fluid is building up, you may have difficulty breathing. And you may also notice large changes in your weight, such as weight gain between dialysis sessions, or gaining 3 or more pounds within 1 to 2 days, or 5 or more pounds in a week, can be signs of holding on to extra fluid. If you're unsure whether to limit your fluid intake, make sure to check with your doctor. And it is a balance of staying well hydrated and not being dehydrated or underhydrated. Next, we'll be discussing some tips to combat thirst and dehydration in the summertime. This is mostly for individuals not on a fluid restriction. So fluids are typically anything that's considered liquid at room temperature. So a lot of your beverages, coffee, tea, water, as well as things that can melt at room temperature. So this would be things like popsicles. A good tip to stay well hydrated is carrying a water bottle or a refillable bottle. This can be a good visual reminder just to make sure that you're drinking enough throughout the course of the day. Remembering to increase your fluid intake during exercise, and especially during hot weather due to losses from sweat. Increasing your fluid intake when sick. You're having a fever can increase your needs. And of course, when vomiting and having diarrhea, we can lose a lot of fluids. And then limiting caffeinated beverages, as these may cause dehydration as well. And we just included some tips for individuals who may have to limit their fluid intake. This can include using measuring cups or marked containers to track your fluid intake over the course of the day. Avoiding salty and sugary foods, as these can increase thirst. Using or having cold beverages can help alleviate that dry mouth. So using ice, frozen fruit, or plastic ice cubes are all good ways to help keep those beverages cold. Using hard candies or lozenges can help stimulate your mouth to produce saliva. And of course, good oral hygiene is important as well. We wanted to include some alternatives to some sugar-sweetened beverages that you may be having this summer. So on the left-hand side would be some examples of some of those higher sugar drinks. And on the right-hand side would be some possible alternatives, such as using flavored seltzer or sparkling water instead of soda, diet soda in moderation, using unsweetened tea, and possibly using sugar substitutes such as stevia or Splenda for sweetener instead of added sugar. Watching your portion sizes for juice to help control blood sugar levels before transplant as well as after transplant. Choosing beverages with less added sugar, and using fruit infused water or Crystal Light, and trying to limit a lot of coffee beverages that may have added sugar and added syrups as well.
Great. The next topic we'll be talking about is a little bit about physical activity. You know, as it warms up, people love to get outside. So we're going to explain a little bit about why physical activity is great for our transplant patients. So staying active and being physically active with strengthening and light cardio is beneficial for transplant because we want people to be in a good physical state before they go into surgery. It just helps lead to better outcomes post-surgery and an easier recovery process. the more stores that we have, the more we have to recover with. Physical activity can be hard, especially when we're not feeling so great. So we just want to encourage everybody that to get in whatever movement that they are able to do. It doesn't have to be a marathon. We're all at different levels of physical ability. So it's really about finding what works for you. Anything is better than nothing. It could be seated, it could be, just doing a few arm movements, leg movements. You can also check in with your doctor, or, if you go to a gym or PT, check in, see what is appropriate for your current state and condition. And also make sure that it's appropriate for you to be participating in physical activity before you do so that you're staying as safe as possible. The exercises that we really recommend patients leading up to transplant and afterwards to do is some light cardio, as well as some weight-bearing exercise. Cardio helps strengthen the heart muscles. It also increases endurance. You can start off small, even walking for just 10 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week is great. And then you can gradually build from there. The general recommendation is to at least aim for 150 minutes of physical activity per week. This would kind of break out to more like 30 minutes per day. But again, start small and then gradually increase as our ability increases. And then we recommend weight-bearing exercise, especially for transplant patients who have issues with calcium absorption and bone health. Weight-bearing exercise has actually been shown to strengthen not only muscle, but bones. It stimulates those cells within our bones to, work and absorb more calcium deposits, and therefore over time, the bones tend to strengthen. You don't have to own weights to be able to do weight-bearing exercise. You can use your own body by doing body movements such as push-up or just sit to stand motions. You can use general household items as weights, whatever you have available to you. And again, you can also start small, start with something that's even just 2 pounds, and then gradually increase as your ability increases. For our kidney transplant patients in the pre-stage, as you get closer to your readiness, we do have a program led by one of our kidney professionals in our research side of things. He's working to send out these videos that were created, as well as provide a resistance band to help patients who kind of are getting into that space, getting closer to their transplant time, build up as much strength as they can, especially if they don't have access to something like physical therapy.
Next, we just wanted to mention that a lot of individuals after transplant or pre-transplant, preparing or while on the waiting list may struggle with weight. At Mass General, we pride ourselves on having a number of resources within the Mass General Brigham system. Here we just listed some wellness and weight loss centers within the region. So depending on where you are, it's nice to have these resources available to everyone wherever you live within the region. And this is a good segue getting to the Frontier Clinic, which is bringing a lot of these resources right to us within transplant. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Excellent job, Hannah and Paul. Thank you so much. And thank you for the introduction. And it's truly an honor to be here with all of you. So the Frontier Clinic stands for Frailty, Obesity, and Nutrition and Transplant. And we've recognized that transplant patients are unique and that they might be told they need to lose weight in order to get a transplant, and might have particular difficulties struggling with weight after transplant. We recognize that there are several barriers that goes into securing a weight center appointment, and so we thought it would be important and a great service to be able to offer weight management services right in your transplant clinic. So we have designed Frontier to do just that. We keep frailty in the name because we do recognize that there is a a certain degree of muscle loss that goes into having a chronic disease and recovering from transplant. We really want to have a strengths-based focus on your care. So we work with your transplant team. We're available at all stages of your transplant, evaluating your strength and resilience from your first appointment. And we're available until years after your transplant in order to enhance your care and provide weight services in your visits. We focus on behavioral interventions, reinforcing what the dietitians do with you, the nutrition aspect, and helping you understand activity cues and hunger cues and how to overcome those. And then we can also use medications, and I prescribe weight loss medications in the clinic, and I work with the surgical weight center at MGH, so we have a direct pathway for patients that might benefit from metabolic and bariatric surgery. So I'm seeing patients right now on Friday mornings in person and Tuesdays virtually. We see right in transplant, 165 Cambridge Street. And then at our multidisciplinary clinics for the liver patients, Alicia has been working to collect strength and frailty information to help the teams. And we're working with our transplant teams to help identify what services you might have through your insurance, whether that be physical therapy, if food insecurity is an issue, how we can help get meals, just ways that we can enhance the care that you're already getting. So Alicia comes to MDC clinics and she's our living donor liver nurse practitioner. So if you have any questions, if you're interested in the clinic, please feel free to reach out. Also, I'm going to update the number here. Please call 617-726-5277 or speak with your transplant teams if you think that this is a service you might be interested in. Right now, we're seeing liver patients. We'll be opening this up to kidney hopefully soon. And if you're not one of those and this is something that's interesting to you, please let us know so that we can communicate with your teams. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So yeah, right now this is now servicing our liver and kidney patients, but hopefully in the future we'll only be able to just expand for our transplant patients as well. Again, most of the programs we've talked about today are from the kidney liver side of things, but the other weight loss clinics are available for all transplant patients, and hopefully, you can always talk to your coordinators about additional resources to access.
So next we'll be discussing some transplant-friendly summer recipe ideas. So just to review, and we tried to keep this information relevant to all types of solid organ transplant, so including our heart, lung, liver, kidney. So in all of these, you'd want to continue to limit your sodium intake. So looking for between 500 to 600 milligrams of sodium per meal or less to keep within that 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day. Choosing whole grains and choosing, say, brown rice over white rice can help control your blood sugar levels pre and post-transplant, as well as can help with satiety as well for meals. Having a variety of fresh or frozen vegetables and fruits can help make sure that our bodies are getting key nutrients such as vitamins and minerals. Choosing low-fat dairy products and lean meats can help with our cholesterol levels. So good question. So for after transplant, dining out would still be okay. We would recommend always trying to have something similar to what you would have at home and kind of keeping within these guidelines as far as sodium, choosing lean meats, fruits and vegetables, and watching your portions of carbohydrates. Yeah, as far as the frank or a hot dog at a baseball game, we typically do recommend kind of against kind of street vendors or consuming foods that might be a higher risk for foodborne illness. And hot dogs can be higher in sodium as well.
Thank you, Paul.
Just some transplant-friendly recipe, kind of continuing on this. When cooking and choosing ingredients, replacing added salt with herbs and spices. So this could be fresh garlic, fresh onion, also using garlic powder or onion powder, watching out for seasonings that have salt in the title. As they suggest, those certain spices are going to be higher in sodium. Reading food labels and choosing foods that have 140 milligrams of sodium per serving or less, which would be considered low sodium. Using heart-healthy cooking oils, so olive oil, canola oil, and limiting more of the saturated types of fats that can just increase our cholesterol levels over time. So this would be things like butter, stick margarine, and then using cooking oils like grilling, baking, and steaming instead of frying.
Yeah, and at least for most solid organ transplant groups, they have great organizations that kind of lead education, and these websites usually have some great recipe resources. Listed here are some examples from the Nash for Kidney Health as well as Heart and Lung. But usually the kidney resources tend to keep the parameters so that they're okay for kind of the other solid organs if you wanted to use them. But usually all the organizations have good suggestions for recipes. And you just want to make sure that the sources you're using are reputable and that they're linked to a reputable source, such as a healthcare institution or government program, such as the USDA or the National Institute of Health, just so that you're making sure the guidelines are within the parameters for your condition. And we just wanted to provide some examples of some possible summer recipes for our transplant patients. The only good way to tell what's in your food is by looking at the nutrition label or preparing it yourself. So this is an example of a nice protein-rich dish. Usually thinking about making the base of our meals kind of a protein vegetable is kind of the best way to get a good, well-rounded nutrient base, especially if we are been diagnosed with diabetes. And then adding some whole grain can also add to the nutrient content. As you can see, this kind of follows our sodium parameters of being around 140 milligrams, and then the carbohydrate content is also less than a serving carbohydrate, which is great. One serving carbohydrate is usually 15 grams, and it's got about 22 grams of protein, which is good for those of us who have higher protein recommendations, such as dialysis patients or anyone with muscle wasting. And yeah, just a little idea of kind of what to look for.
And we wanted to include kind of a dessert recipe idea as well. So this recipe is more of a sorbet. It uses some frozen cherries. It also includes some water, and it does include some sweetener. And this could always be omitted, the sweetener, or a sugar substitute could be used as well. But even with the small amount of added sugar, the total carbohydrates are a reasonable amount per serving. It's less than the 15 grams of carbohydrates, which would be considered one carb exchange. The calories are less than 50 calories. So this could be a kind of a good summer recipe idea for, or an alternative to say ice cream or other higher calorie, higher sugar desserts that may be out there.
So thanks for listening to all this information. We hope it's been beneficial for you. We'd now like to transition into our Q&A session. Paul and I had some questions submitted, which we'll go through first, but also feel free to submit some questions to the Q&A for them, and we'll take a look at that as well. So leading off, we definitely had a lot of questions about, protein recommendation pre and post transplant, as well as for people who are more active or training for certain physical like training activities like marathon, which kudos to you guys for running a marathon. So really protein can differ between the different organs. If you have no protein restriction, usually the recommended RDA is 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per kilogram of your current body weight. For our pre-transplant patients in the kidney realm, it's usually, if you're on dialysis, it's usually a little bit higher protein needs, since you're having a little bit more risk of muscle wasting on dialysis. So that'd be about 1.2 grams per kilogram of your body weight. And then for patients who are not on dialysis, it would be about the same, a little bit lower than the RDA, that 0.8 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. If you're training for a marathon, no protein restriction, sticking to that RDA or a little bit higher to help with muscle retention and growth would be good. But, it's best to kind of check in with your care team and your doctor to see what recommendation is best for you. But protein is definitely important, especially with maintaining muscle health. And also post-transplant, when you're kind of right in that healing stage, can help with skin repair, muscle repair, and be good. And then, just checking in to see if those protein needs adjust over time.
And yeah, just to reinforce with that too, you could always work with a dietitian or other members of your healthcare team, like Hannah said, just to make sure that your training and your intake aligns with your specific condition, whether you're pre-transplant or post-transplant. Yeah, but making sure to check in with your healthcare providers. The next question had to deal with healthy eating, but still struggling with weight loss after transplant. Are procedures like liposuction okay? This would be important to discuss with your healthcare team, as well as the transplant surgeon, to make sure that there's no risks associated with these, and that if any additional surgeries or procedures would be appropriate for your specific stage, whether you're pre or post-transplant.
And then we had some questions again, kind of relating back to the food safety. So are things like egg salad and chicken salad okay to eat, especially since they're served cold? Yes, we would say that this is appropriate. Obviously being a little bit more careful of food parameters if you're on immunosuppressive medications, as long as those eggs are cooked well and the chicken is cooked well prior to going into the salad, it should be fine.
The next question has to do with immunosuppression. So further out from transplant, as the goals for the different medications are decreased, are better equipped to fight off foodborne illness. So individuals after transplant, you will be on those immunosuppression medications lifelong. So there is always the risk having that weakened immune system, being just slightly more susceptible to foodborne illness. So you would still want to practice food safety. So handling foods properly, cooking foods to the proper temperature, and avoiding those high risk foods, as Hannah had mentioned earlier.
And then what is the best way to manage cholesterol levels? So as Paul mentioned in our parameters for, creating those meals for transplant patients, consuming foods that are lower in saturated and trans fats, such as our more processed foods, really fatty marbled beef, fried foods, stuff that has a lot of the saturated trans fats in them, that can lead to increased cholesterol. So choosing leaner proteins, lower fat dairy, and then overall lower fat foods can help with managing your cholesterol level. and then talking with your care team or doctors about any appropriate medications to help with cholesterol as well.
Next, is it common to struggle with weight loss after transplant? So yes, this is a common barrier that we see. So typically after transplant, as part of those anti-rejection medications, one medication in particular is called prednisone, which is a steroid medication, and that can cause increased appetite. Typically, our diet is less restrictive after transplant. And generally feeling better can lead to increased appetite as well. So this is something that we see often, and Hannah and I counsel patients on regularly, and Michelle as well, seeing this a lot in our clinic as well.
Yeah, Michelle, did you have any comment on that?
Yeah, there's behavioral and nutritional aspects to managing weight, and there are some factors that we can control and can't control, like our genetics and medications that we have to take after transplant. But there are things that are available to us, like medications for weight management, surgeries, which have to be used on the baseline of nutritional and behavioral adaptations. So really gathering your team around to help where we can support, weight loss for one person is different than weight loss for another person. So really engaging with your team, engaging with a weight specialist to really understand where are my areas for opportunity, knowing that it's not just one intervention that's helpful, and we have a lot to work against.
Thank you. So the next question had to do with medications that might recommend you to take more protein with them. What are some good protein sources that you could take? If you have no protein restriction, then our animal-based proteins are a little bit higher protein content, but you can use a mix of plant-based and animal-based proteins. A good breakfast would be like some peanut butter and toast. You could look into, appropriate proteins to add to smoothies. Making sure you're kind of consuming an adequate portion of protein at your meals. Usually we say about 3 ounces or more if you're not on a protein restriction. For those who are on a protein restriction or dealing with kidney disease that are not on dialysis, plant-based proteins are a little bit easier on the kidneys to process. And, maybe bulking up some of your meals with those plant-based proteins, and then just being mindful of your overall protein intake. Yeah.
Our next question was asking about tips and tricks to support healthful weight loss while on the kidney wait list and after transplant. And again, I think just to reiterate what Michelle said, there's kind of no one simple approach. I would say involving your whole team. Including all providers, because it is kind of multi-dimensional and everyone is kind of different. Involving nutrition, Michelle, all specialties, social work, again, many approaches to help with weight loss.
And one thing that we haven't talked much about, there was a nice little session on it, but one thing that I want to emphasize is exercise, which is challenging at certain stages of transplant. But exercise and physical activity doesn't have to be fancy or look like CrossFit. It can just be something that's a little bit more than what you're doing now. And so, strategies like if you like walking a certain amount, walking with some weights, or, try to pushing it just a little bit further, parking farther away, a few spots back. There are strength exercises you can do in a chair, and those are things that I think at many stages of a transplant journey, exercise and physical activity is neglected. But again, I know we have some marathon runners here, which is awesome, but it doesn't have to look like a marathon. It can be simple leg lifts, or using soup cans to do bicep curls in your kitchen while sitting down is just that much better than not engaging in those activities. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Definitely. And then our next question had to do with how does the transplant process increase the risk of developing diabetes. So a common thing we can see with post-transplant patients is an increase in baseline blood sugar. And that tends to have to do with some of the medications that you're on post-transplant, especially prednisone, just poses a higher risk of increasing those sugars, as well as creating a little bit of insulin resistance, which could eventually, lead to diabetes over time. But, hopefully we're monitoring this closely. You can interject the proper interventions as we track the blood sugars, and can adjust medications to help address this as well if we are able.
And this is especially important too for individuals with diabetes going into transplant as well. Managing your diabetes can become more difficult, especially on those higher doses of those medications right after transplant. So really engaging with the team and working with your endocrinologist for individuals with diabetes before transplant to really help anticipate that change after transplant.
And then what are some diet tips for gluten intolerant pescatarians? So we know we have a lot of people who probably have a lot of different diet parameters, are dealing with multiple different conditions that require different things from our diet. So again, it might be beneficial to kind of work with a professional such as a dietitian, either part of the clinic or within your community, to help kind of address different areas of the diet that could be impacting the conditions that you have. And then, in terms of, then we can kind of learn better about what foods impact these conditions as well. It's kind of hard to address one or multiple conditions with one encompassing diet.
What are recommendations for protein per day after transplant? So Hannah touched on this before. Your protein needs are going to be individualized. They can change depending on the type of transplant you've had, if other conditions or processes that might be going on in your body can also change your protein needs. But typically after transplant, your protein needs would be higher to help with your recovery and wound healing after transplant.
And then what is the best way to lose weight after 65 years old? We definitely have a wide ranging population based on age, especially with transplants. So, again, it's really what works best for you. After 65, we might become a little bit more sedentary. So again, getting in that movement during the day, and then just, being mindful of the food choices that we're allowed regarding our certain transplant disease process, and, again, whatever kind of works with your lifestyle, and then checking in with your care team to see what's appropriate.
And I would say in an aging population, we have to keep in mind that hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are decreasing, and ways that we can combat that is with strength training. So I'm going to put in another plug for exercise, but in particular, strength and resistance training has more of an impact than cardiac activity, cardiovascular activity like running or jogging for weight loss, and especially in an aging population. So focus on muscle. Muscle is the key here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we lose muscle as we age, and that can affect our metabolism. So yeah, like Michelle said.
Mm-hmm.
Really quickly, I just noticed there was a question specifically about this, but I wanted to ask the tail end of it. Is spin class safe if not on dialysis?
So I would say check with your nephrologist, or if you have a cardiologist, your cardiologist. Sometimes medications that you're on that lead to chronic kidney disease can contribute to exercise not being safe, like if you're on insulin or cardiac medication. So for this particular person, check with your cardiac team, with your medical team, excuse me. For most people, yes, but it is a high intensity activity. And if you haven't done it before, you might not want to jump on a Peloton really intense class, but ease into it, go slow, keep your intensity low. And please, please, please just check with your medical team before you start a high intensity activity. And yeah, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. And then why might I be more fatigued pre or post-transplant? So depending on your condition, especially with the kidney disease, it can impact how our blood cells are produced. We are more higher risk of becoming anemic. Also, organ failure just puts a lot of strain on the body itself and can make you feel a little bit more tired. And if our organs aren't processing out what they're supposed to, it can also lead to buildup of certain byproducts that make us feel a little bit more tired, as well as may impact appetite and other parts of our daily lives. So, overall, it can lead to fatigue and just feeling a little bit more tired during the day.
What are the best exercises post-transplant aside from walking? And again, I think this really depends on your condition, and like Michelle said, always checking with your team before starting new types of exercise and starting gradually. Anything that you'd like to add, Michelle?
Strength training.
Yes.
You get a theme?
Yep.
Yeah, but start where you're at. Start where you're at. There should be like a 1 to 3 week familiarization program or period with any new exercise program. Give yourself some time to ease into a new activity. And I would say here what we haven't talked about is it should be something you enjoy. Don't try to start something that you're going to dread attending. Do something that brings you joy and something that you look forward to, maybe something that you can share with community, friends, or other members of your group. But enjoy it.
Mhm.
And that's another little tip.
Yes, and same with, the diet pieces. You gotta kind of enjoy what you're consuming. So, it just makes those overall habit changes easier if you already kind of know that you like the changes that you're making. And then what is some advice for relieving gout symptoms with diet? Gout is a common condition, especially in some certain types of organ failure. The buildup of uremia and uric acid can lead to increased gout. So some ways we can battle this through diet is avoiding foods that contain purines. Purines, when consumed, stimulate production of uric acid, which then can lead to more gout flares. So there are certain foods that we can limit in our diet that can help relieve gout symptoms. Some of these foods, that we want to avoid include a lot of our kind of fatty meats, as well as shellfish. For some reason, these proteins contain more of these purines. And then things like beer and alcohol can also contribute high purine amounts to our diet. So consuming those in moderation or trying to avoid them as much as we can. Things like smaller fish like anchovies, sardines, those can have a higher amount of purines. And then some organ meats as well, just, in the way that the purines build up in these organs and then we consume them, it can contribute more purines to our diet. And then yeast and yeast extracts can also contribute purines. These are all considered high purine foods. Some other kind of moderate protein content foods are some of our vegetables, so like asparagus, cauliflower, spinach, mushrooms, green peas, but these are all fine to consume. You just have to watch out for the portion size. So we usually recommend about half a cup to avoid overdoing it with the purine content. And then they also recommend limiting oatmeal to about 2/3 of a cup if you are someone who deals with gout flares quite often.
And when phosphate is listed on a product, how do you know how many milligrams are in the product? So this is very common, or common issue with our individuals with kidney disease or having any sort of complications related to their kidneys after transplant, which is common throughout the various types of solid organ transplant. So phosphorus is difficult. It's added to a lot of foods, and manufacturers aren't required to put the specific amount of phosphorus that's in a product. So this would make tracking your phosphorus intake very difficult. And I'll turn it over to Hannah because she has a lot of experience from the dialysis world with
Yes. Phosphorus can just be very hard to get rid of. It's not something that's processed out well by the body, especially with kidney failure. So a big thing to look at, especially on the nutrition label, is that in the ingredients, anything that contains phos, the ingredient will kind of start with the word phos, so PHOS. There's these certain additives, again, that Paul mentioned, that are added to the foods. But usually most of them contain the word phos or phosphate in them, so it's easy to kind of tell. Unfortunately, these phosphorus additives are absorbed more quickly by our bodies or in higher amounts compared to our naturally occurring phosphorus in like potatoes and other root vegetables. So it's just important to kind of, try to limit these higher like processed foods or foods that have a lot of phosphorus additives in them. And it's also important to take your phosphorus binders, which can be very hard to remember, kind of as on time and as we can, and try to like stick to the regimen that we've been put on, which will help control that phosphorus amount in the body and eliminate that excess phos that we're consuming. But yeah, just being a little bit mindful of those foods if you're having an issue with the phosphorus.
And a good trick too with phosphorus, if it is listed on the ingredient or on the nutrition facts label, but say it's being identified as a % daily value, there's a good rule. It's called the 5 and 20 rule. So if it's 5% of the daily value or less, it's considered to be low in that specific nutrient. And if it's 20% or higher, that would be considered a very high, or food very high in that specific nutrient. So in that case, the phosphorus. So even if the milligrams aren't displayed, you can also use that % daily value as a tip to kind of guide your food choices.
And then going along with the nutrients of what types of magnesium supplements are appropriate for patients on tacrolimus or that have a magnesium deficiency. So, in terms of magnesium supplements, it's best to just check with your post-transplant coordinator or care team to see which ones are appropriate for you to take and in what amount. Besides that, one way we can kind of help increase our magnesium is that we can consume foods that contain magnesium. So some of these foods include, brand cereals, certain fish like salmon, spinach, and then nuts and seeds, if those are appropriate for our diet, tofu, beans, some more natural kind of peanut butters, and then, avocado. We can always find lists, or you can ask your care team if they have a list of higher magnesium foods. The main way we can change, if we have a low in certain nutrients, just by either taking a supplement or consuming more of a food that contains that certain nutrient.
And then we also received a lot of questions regarding individuals' transplant candidacy. So we would encourage you to check with your transplant coordinator to check on your status as far as your transplant candidacy, or if you're interested in being referred to the program, please talk to your primary care or your primary nephrologist regarding being referred to our wonderful program.
Yeah, and then same with weight loss medication questions. We had a lot of, but thankfully we have Michelle here who addressed that for us very well. Again, checking with your care team, seeing if it's appropriate for your, overall health conditions and, your weight loss journey. And, if you want a referral to one of our weight centers, checking in with your coordinators or your nephrologist or whoever leads your care, seeing what the best way to get referred is, or check out our wonderful Frontier clinic that we've started where our kidney and liver patients.
Yeah, and just a quick plug for Ozempic. There's a lot of questions about that going around. That is a medication that works in 3 ways. It stimulates your pancreas to secrete more insulin, your liver to release less glucose, and it slows down digestion. It has a about a 1 to 1.5% decrease in your A1C, but significant decrease in weight. It can be anywhere but around 15% of your total body weight. That medication in the pre-transplant space, we have to take into consideration with an upcoming surgery. It does have to be stopped before surgery, but then after transplant, we don't run into those questions. There is a global supply. It's very hard to get semaglutide or Ozempic, which is the diabetes form, and Wegovy, which is the non-diabetes form. But I would generally stay clear of anything that's not FDA approved. Those are the compounded medications that you see in a lot of Facebook ads or Instagram ads. I would be cautious of getting into anything that's not prescribed by somebody in primary care, a weight center, or something that's off-label, which is the compounded medications.
Great. So that's kind of from our submitted questions. Stacy, were there any other questions that stood out in the chat?
Yes, there are a few questions that came through. You may have touched on some of them, but it is 6 o'clock, so
Okay.
I wanted to be mindful of everyone's time and not cut into anyone's dinner. So I don't know if you wanted to spend 5 more minutes to see if you could wrap up, or let me see. Did you guys see any questions that stood out to y'all?
Let me take a look.
So one person asks, how do we know what is a kilogram or body weight measurement conversion?
Of course. So to convert your body weight from pounds to kilograms, you would just take your body weight in pounds and divide that by 2.2. So your body weight in pounds divided by 2.2 is your body weight in kilograms. And then say you're allowed 1 gram of protein per kilogram of your body weight, and you're 54 kilograms, then you would be allowed 54 grams of protein.
And I will say Google is your best friend. You can actually type it in and it'll do the conversion for you.
Or ask your dietitian.
Yeah. And I generally estimate like half of what you weigh. Just cut it in half and there's your range.
Thank you. Is there a general food map that may be shared which lists the best food choices by protein, carb, vegetable, fruits, etc. for organ transplant patients?
There really isn't an all-encompassing resource. It's pretty individualized, especially based on your labs. We usually track the labs closely to see if anything's above goal range or below goal range, and then we usually make our diet recommendations based off of that. If anything, going back to those general like healthful diet guidelines that were reviewed in the presentation, it's more kind of just sticking with a healthful diet, and then whatever's generally recommended for your form of organ transplant, such as cardiac, following that low sodium diet, or for, the kidneys, following, monitoring added sugars, high sodium, and then if anything like potassium or phosphorus are out of range, just making sure that you're kind of adjusting your diet to help manage those as well.
Okay, I have one question. Is an occasional beer or glass of wine okay post-transplant? And maybe answer about pre-transplant too.
Yeah, so I did want to circle back with this when we were talking about the purine rich foods and managing gout. We had kind of talked about limiting alcohol intake, but especially for individuals after liver transplant, abstaining from alcohol is very important. So you would still want to follow the guidelines provided to you by your providers. So it's abstaining from alcohol after liver transplant. And then for kidney and lung and heart, you would want to check with your coordinators and team as far as when to resume alcohol, which quantity you would want to have it in to make sure that you're taking the best care of your new organ as possible.
Thank you, Paul and Hannah. So someone asks, so no raw oysters or sushi before transplant. I understand post-op. How about in moderation? So it sounds like we have a sushi fan.
Yeah, so actually pre is okay. It's really just when you start those immunosuppressive medications. Obviously pre, if you know your immune system is suppressed or you're on these medications before transplant, you have to avoid raw fish like sushi and oysters, just because they're probably the highest risk food for foodborne illnesses. And then post, yes, we highly recommend that you avoid them, as your immune system will be suppressed by the medications that you're on. We just want to keep everybody safe, and, getting an infection will just increase, your risk of having adverse effects post-surgery, and just can lead to other complications as well.
And there are some workarounds, just to summarize too, such as any cooked seafood would be okay. So if it was, say, or a vegetable base roll, like a California roll, that's generally would be okay. And of course, for pre-transplant as well, always choosing like a reputable sushi house. I would say, in general, avoid gas station sushi would be a good recommendation.
I
there-
think, Michelle, you had a question in the chat. It only came to the hosts. So they said they were curious if pre-kidney transplant clinic program would allow pre-heart transplant candidates. And Michelle, you had typed out the answer, but I don't know if the person who asked received it.
Okay, yeah. So the exercise program that was discussed in the presentation is a clinical trial in the pre-kidney group. To my knowledge, there's no like uniform exercise program throughout organ transplant, but I would reach out to your individual teams. In Frontier, it is a very strong component of my discussions, and I will lead folks through building an exercise program. But if you have questions regarding your specific organ, your team might be able to provide you with the appropriate resources. They do exist, just not as a structured program.
Thank you. I feel like you guys answered this, but I was a little distracted reading the chat. Since being on prednisone, I struggle with increased appetite. What is the best way to manage late night eating?
So one thing that I commonly recommend is making sure to have consistent meals throughout the day. I always say skipping a meal on prednisone is like going to the grocery store when you're hungry. So you might only go in for a small amount, but yeah, if you skip a meal, that next meal, going into that meal hungrier than usual, you might kind of overindulge that next meal. So yeah, having consistent meals throughout the day, having balanced meals, so including a protein at meals, as well as whole grains and fruits and vegetables can be a good source of fiber, which can help with satiety with meals as well.
All right. Oh, one more question just came through. Does it make a difference in food cravings if prednisone is taken at night versus in the morning?
I believe it potentially can, depending on the timing. So that could be something to discuss with your team. And then so I would say discuss with your coordinator and your team.
All right. I think that might be all the questions that we have. Oh, there's one more, sorry.
That's okay.
What about nutritional yeast for kidney transplant?
Not 100% sure on that. Nutritional yeast usually has a cheesy flavor, so I think in the pre-transplant realm, it's okay. Again, reputable sources. I'm not 100% sure about post-transplant.
Yeah, we can look that up and get back to that.
It is pasteurized.
Okay, that's good.
I think as long as the bag says it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that would be a good practice.
Definitely. Yeah, we just want to make sure it's been heated to the proper temperature and that it's safe.
All right, and then we did have one comment essentially asking for more up-to-date information about nutritional guidance. I don't know if you guys want to talk about the work that we have underway with some of our researchers as well as NKF for creating culturally competent food recipes and whatnot. So I don't know, Hannah and Paul, did you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so I think our IRB has just been submitted. We're doing a little bit of research and trying to create culturally appropriate materials based on food recommendations for organ transplant. Right now, we're focusing on a kidney lens, but really should be able to span it to most organ transplants. You know, we just want to make sure that we're recommending foods that work with people's lifestyle as well as their cultural heritage, that, you know, we don't want to take away foods that, you know, might make up the bulk of their meals, and just being culturally sensitive. So we're working with our outreach coordinators and, you know, research side of the team to see how we can best address this gap that we have right now.
Just to wrap up as well, you can always talk to your providers about a referral to seeing a dietitian. Many conditions like diabetes and kidney disease are covered conditions, so most insurances would cover a visit with a dietitian. So asking for that, and there's resources to find a dietitian in your area.
Yeah, there's some great dietitians out there, especially in your community. So definitely use those resources, and just asking and staying up to date with your care team.
All right. Sorry, there one more question just came through. I feel so bad to leave them hanging.
That's okay.
Spam and kimchi, are canned foods allowed post-heart transplant? And I'm assuming is spam and kimchi allowed as well?
So kimchi would be it's a
Yeah.
fermented food.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of there's a lot of debate even amongst dietitians and other providers as far as what would be considered safe. Generally, it is recommended to avoid kimchi and other fermented foods such as kombucha, which is a fermented tea that may have been brewed at home or in someone's house. But it generally, if it's commercially prepared and it's been say at like the grocery store and it's been pasteurized or prepared in a way that meets food safety guidelines, generally it would be okay. But still making sure to check with your team to make sure that it would be okay. And spam, that would be it's a processed meat. It is very high in sodium. So you would want to take into account the salt content of that. And again, heating meats to the proper temperature, and possibly choosing more fresh protein choices like chicken, fish, beans, some choices that can be lower in sodium as well.
Yeah, our canned meats and our deli meats just pose a little bit of a higher risk for foodborne illness contamination. So we really just got to make sure that we're getting it from a reputable source, or then heating it to the proper temperature, like Paul mentioned afterwards, or choosing a protein that's a little bit lower in risk for foodborne illness.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your days to host this and also to answer these questions. I do want to give you guys the floor for any closing remarks. Michelle, if you have anything to say, and then we can wrap things up.
Yeah. Michelle, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, no, nothing in particular. I think that this is a great program. I'm so happy to be able to enhance the services of your transplant teams, and more than willing to be a resource for you for health, wellness, weight management, strength through your transplant journey. So please don't be a stranger.
Yes, we are so happy to have you, Michelle.
And Hannah and Paul, you guys are great to work with. So thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah, and just thank you guys for allowing us the space to present on these topics. You know, we just hope to be a help to all of the patients that come our way. You know, a lot comes along with organ transplantation, and, you know, just want you guys to know that there's great dietitians out there. We're all kind of here to try to help you in the best way possible. And we're so happy to be able to provide some education today.
Yeah, and something that's very nice is that we get to follow you through your transplant journey, which can feel like a marathon sometimes. So we just really like getting to know you before your transplant, as well as providing that continuity of care through your transplant journey as well.
All right, thank you all, and thank you everyone who joined. This program was recorded, and as always, we post it approximately a week after the event date. So keep an eye out, and if you registered, I will send out an email with the direct link to the YouTube video. But if you follow us on YouTube or on our social media platforms, you'll get a notification as well. So Until next time, actually next week, Wednesday the 29th, we're actually going to have our quarterly transplant update with all the solid organ transplant directors. They'll be talking about measles because recently Dr. Cotton, who, as you all know, is part of the ACIP for vaccination committee through the CDC. There's been some new information that's been released about measles strategies for protection and some things that may affect transplant patients. So it's a really interesting talk. We invite you, your loved ones, and even your care teams to join. So please feel free to share the invitation to anyone you think would benefit from the program. And it's next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Right? Bye, everyone. Have a nice night.